The most powerful man in artificial intelligence just admitted defeat. Not in a leaked memo, not in a rumor. On camera, on CNBC, days after reporting one of the biggest quarters in his company's history, Jensen Huang said his company has largely conceded China's AI chip market to Huawei. He didn't hedge it, he didn't soften it. Huawei is very, very strong, he told the interviewer, and then he moved on like he'd just read the weather. Sit with that for a second. This is the same man who spent the last 2 years telling anyone who would listen that China was nanoseconds behind American silicon. Now he's standing in front of investors admitting the company that used to sell almost nothing in China's AI market has quietly built a wall Nvidia can no longer climb. So what actually happened? And is it really as simple as China won? Stay with me, because the honest answer is messier and more interesting than either headline you've probably already seen. Start with the chip that forced Huang's hand. In March 2026, Huawei unveiled the Ascend 950 PR, a chip purpose-built for the unglamorous but essential work of AI inference, the part of artificial intelligence where a trained model actually answers your question. Huawei claims it delivers nearly 3 times the performance of Nvidia's H20, the cut-down chip Nvidia was allowed to sell into China under export restrictions. 3 times. Against a chip Nvidia designed specifically to stay inside the rules. And the 950 PR isn't a one-off. It's the second step in a 3-year roadmap Huawei laid out in public. The 950 DT, tuned for training instead of inference, was scheduled to land by the end of 2026. The Ascend 960, aimed at matching Nvidia's Blackwell-class architecture, is targeted for 2027. A 4th chip, the 970, is already on the board for 2028. This isn't a company chasing a headline. It's a company running a published multi-year sprint and hitting its marks. And it isn't just single chips anymore. Huawei has been linking thousands of Ascend chips together into what it calls a SuperPOD, a cluster built to compensate for weaker individual chips with sheer scale. The current generation strings together more than 8,000 Ascend processors, delivering a combined memory pool north of 1,000 terabytes and an interconnect bandwidth measured in petabytes per second. It's a brute force answer to a precision problem, and on paper, the raw numbers are staggering. Here's the proof. It isn't just a spec sheet fantasy. Huawei has reportedly used its own chips to train OpenPangu 2.0, a large language model built entirely on Ascend hardware with no Nvidia silicon anywhere in the pipeline. That matters more than any single benchmark. For years, the assumption in the AI world was that you simply could not train a frontier-class model without Nvidia underneath it. That assumption just took a direct hit. This isn't staying in a lab either. Baidu, one of China's largest cloud operators, is reportedly moving to integrate the 950 PR directly into its Kunlun data center infrastructure, with rollout targeted for the 3rd quarter of 2026. That's the difference between a chip that photographs well at a launch event and a chip that ends up doing real paid work inside a company's actual servers. Huawei is clearing that bar. The market numbers back up the panic. A few years ago, Nvidia controlled the overwhelming majority of China's AI chip market. Today, industry trackers put Huawei's share of that same market at roughly half, with Nvidia down to something like 8%. ByteDance alone is reported to have committed $5.6 billion to Huawei Silicon. Chris Miller, the historian who literally wrote the book on the global chip war, put it bluntly. That kind of spending isn't a procurement decision. It's a statement that China's biggest AI companies are building their future on domestic hardware. That's the story everyone's telling right now. Nvidia humbled. China triumphant. Case closed. Except it isn't closed, because if you actually follow the silicon back to where it's made, the picture gets a lot more complicated and a lot less triumphant. Here's the part most of the excited headlines skip. Huawei doesn't manufacture its own chips. Almost everything Huawei designs gets built by a company called SMIC, China's answer to Taiwan's TSMC, and SMIC is stuck. Cut off from the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that TSMC and Samsung use to print the world's most advanced chips, SMIC has been forced to squeeze 7 nanometer class chips out of older deep ultraviolet tools using brute force multi-patterning tricks to get there. It works. But it's expensive, it's slow, and reported yields on those advanced lines sit somewhere between 20 and 40%. For comparison, a healthy modern chip line runs closer to 90. To be fair, SMIC isn't standing still either. By late 2025, it had climbed to third place globally in quarterly foundry revenue, trailing only TSMC and Samsung, and a second Chinese foundry, Huahong, has reportedly started bringing its own 7 nanometer line online, which would finally break SMIC's monopoly on advanced domestic manufacturing. Progress is real. It just isn't fast and it isn't cheap. Beijing knows manufacturing is the real bottleneck, which is why the state has poured close to $48 billion into a fund built specifically to force this problem open. Money can buy factories. It can't instantly buy the 15 years of accumulated manufacturing know-how that TSMC has. Even with an ambitious 5-fold expansion plan on the books, China's entire advanced chip output is still a small fraction of what a single TSMC facility produces in Taiwan. So here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask out loud. Is Huawei actually winning the technology race, or is it winning a much narrower race, the one for the market Nvidia was legally barred from fully competing in? Because a report referenced by the Council on Foreign Relations makes a claim that cuts hard against the China One narrative. Its projection, by 2027, the best American AI chips could be as much as 17 times more powerful than Huawei's top offering. 17 times. If that number holds up, then what we're watching isn't Huawei beating Nvidia on raw engineering. It's Huawei becoming good enough, for now, for a market Nvidia was never allowed to fully serve in the first place. There's another moat nobody photographs for a press release, and it might matter more than any transistor count. Nvidia's real advantage was never only the silicon. It's CUDA, the software layer Nvidia has spent nearly 2 decades building, with millions of developers who've written their entire careers around it. Every time a Chinese lab switches to Ascend, it isn't just buying a chip, it's rebuilding years of software from scratch. That friction is real, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't show up in a horsepower comparison, but quietly decides who wins over a decade instead of a headline cycle. And that friction is starting to split the entire world into 2 separate technology stacks. One runs on Nvidia and CUDA, the standard almost every AI lab outside China has built on for a decade. The other runs on Huawei and Ascend, growing fast but largely walled off inside China's own borders. For any company doing business globally, that split isn't an abstraction. It's a real decision about which ecosystem to build on, and increasingly, the answer depends less on which chip is faster and more on which government you're trying to stay compliant with. And that changes what Huang's largely conceded quote actually means. He wasn't saying Nvidia lost the technology race. He was describing a market he'd been fighting to stay inside of for years, one where the rules kept shifting under him. Chips got approved for export, then blocked at customs, then approved again, then reportedly shipped in what one US official called only a trivial quantity. You cannot build lasting market share in a country when your own government keeps changing whether you're even allowed to sell there. Huawei didn't have that problem. Huawei had years of uninterrupted access to its own home market, while Nvidia's access flickered on and off like a bad connection. That's the real headline hiding underneath the dramatic one. This isn't purely a story about whose engineers are smarter. It's a story about what happens to market share when one competitor gets locked out of the building for years at a time. None of this means Nvidia is actually struggling. In the same quarter, Huang made his comment. Nvidia reported revenue of $81.62 billion, up 85% from the year before. That is not the balance sheet of a company in crisis. It's the balance sheet of a company that just lost one very specific, very symbolic battle in one country, while still dominating almost everywhere else on the planet. So where does this actually go from here? Huawei keeps its roadmap running, chip after chip, closing the gap by design rather than by accident. SMIC keeps fighting the manufacturing war nobody sees on a spec sheet, the one measured in yield percentages and wafer counts instead of flashy performance claims. And Nvidia keeps building for the 90% of the world where the export battle doesn't apply, defending a software moat that took 20 years to dig, while quietly hoping Washington and Beijing eventually agree on rules stable enough to let it compete for the other 10. The chip war isn't over. It just proved something nobody wanted to admit. In a fight this close, the deciding factor was never only the silicon, it was the politics wrapped around it and the software built on top of it. And both of those, unlike a chip, can change their minds overnight.